long. He will hurry for his own sake. If he does not get you, he will have to buy a wife, and there is not a pice or trinket left with us. He will get you if he wants a wife. Have no fear. A vague hope filled Nuran's being. She felt as if she belonged to the house or the house to her. The charpai she sat on, the buffalo, the Jagga's mother, all were hers. She would come back even if Jagga failed to turn up. She could tell them she was married. The thought of her father came like a dark cloud over her lunar hopes. She would slip away without telling him. The moon shone again. Bebe, if I get the chance, I will come to stay, say Sat Sri Akal in the morning. Sat Sri Akal, I must go and pack. Nuran hugged the old woman passionately. Sat Sri Akal, she said a little breathlessly again, and went out. Jagga's mother sat on her charpai, staring into the dark for several hours. Not many people slept in Manu Majra that night. They went from house to house, talking, crying, swearing love and friendship, assuring each other that this would soon be over. Life, they said, would be as it always had been. Imam Baksh came back from his round of Muslim homes before Nuran had turned. Nothing had been packed. He was too depressed to be angry with her. It was as hard on the young as the old. She must have gone to see some of her friends. He started pottering around looking for gunny bags, tin canisters and trunks. A few minutes later, Nuran came in. Have you seen all your girls' friends? Let us get this done before we sleep, said Imam Baksh. You go to bed, I will put things in. There is not much to do, and you must be tired, she answered. Yes, I am a little tired, he said, sitting on his charpai. You pack the clothes now. We can put in the cooking utensils in the morning after you have cooked something for the journey. Imam Baksh stretched himself on the bed and fell asleep. There was not much for Nuran to do. The Punjabi peasant's baggage consists of little besides a change of clothes, a quilt, a pillow, a couple of pitchers, cooking utensils, and perhaps a brass plate and a copper tumbler or two. All that can be put on the single piece of furniture they possess, a charpai. Nuran put her own and father's clothes in the grey, battered steel trunk, which had been with them ever since she could remember. She lit a fire in the hearth to bake a few chapatis for the next day. Within half an hour, she had done the cooking. She rinsed the utensils and put them in a gunny bag. Flour, salt, the spices, and remained went in biscuit and cigarette tins, which in their turn went inside an empty kerosene oil can with a wood top. The packing was over. All that remained was to roll her quilt around the pillow, put the odds and ends on the charpai, and the charpai on the buffalo. She could carry the piece of broken mirror in her hand. It rained intermittently all night. Early in the morning, it became a regular downpour. Villagers who had stayed up most of the night fell asleep in the monotonous patter of rain and the opiate of the fresh morning breeze. The tooting of motor horns and the high note of truck engines in low gear plowing their way through the slush and mud woke up the entire village. The convoy went around the Mano Majra looking for a lane wide enough to let their trucks in. In front was a jeep fitted with a loudspeaker. There were two officers in it, a Sikh, the one who had come after the ghost train, and a Muslim. Behind the jeep were a dozen trucks. One of the trucks was full of Pathan soldiers and another one full of Sikhs. They all were they were all gun armed with stain guns. The convoy came to a halt outside the village. The only jeep could make its way through. It drove up to the center and stopped behind the platform under the peepal tree. Two officers stepped out. The Sikh asked one of the villagers to fetch the Lambardar. The Muslim was joined by the Pathan soldiers. He sent them out in batches of three to knock at every door and ask the Muslims to come out. For a few minutes, Mano Majra echoes to cry of all Muslims going to Pakistan, come out at once. Come, all Muslims, out at once. Slowly the Muslims began to come out of their homes, driving their cattle and their bullock carts loaded with charpais, rolls of bedding, tin trunks, kerosene oil tins, earthen pitchers, and brass utensils. The rest of Mano Majra came out to see them off. The two officers and the Lambardar were the last to come out of the village. The jeep followed them. They were talking and gesticulating animatedly. Most of the talking was between the Muslim officer and the Lambardar. I have no arrangement to take all this luggage with bullock carts, beds, pots, and pans. This convoy is not going to Pakistan by road. We are taking them to Chundunagar refugee camp and from there by train to Lahore. They can only take their clothes, bedding, cash, and jewelry. Tell them to leave everything else here. You can look after it. The news that the Mano Majra Muslims were going to Pakistan came as a surprise. The Lambardar had believed they would only go to refugee camp for a few days and then return. No, Sahib, we cannot say anything, replied the Lambardar. If it was for a day or two, we could look after their belongings. As you are going to Pakistan, it may be many months before they return. The property is a bad thing. It poisons people's mind. No, we will not touch anything. We will only look after their houses. The Musalman was officer was irritated. I have no time to argue. You see yourself that all I have is a dozen trucks. I cannot put buffaloes and bullock carts in them. No, Sahib, retorted the Lambardar stubbornly. You can say what you like, and you can be angry with us, but we will not touch our brother's properties. You want us to become enemies? Wah wah, Lamardar Sahib, answered the Muslim, laughing loudly. Shabash. Yesterday you wanted to kill them, today you call them brothers. You may change your mind again tomorrow. Don't taunt us like this, Captain Sahib. We are brothers and we will always remain brothers. Alright, Lambardar, we are brothers, officer said. I grant you that, but I still cannot take all this stuff. You consult the Sardar officer and your fellow villagers about it. I will deal with the Muslims. The Muslim officer got on the jeep and addressed the crowd. He chose his words carefully. We have a dozen trucks, and all you people who are going to Pakistan must get on them in 10 minutes. We have other villages to evacuate later. The only luggage you can take with you is what you can carry, nothing more. You can leave your cattle, bullock carts, charpais, pitchers, and so on with your friends in the village. If we get a chance, we will bring these things out for you later. I will give you 10 minutes to settle your affairs, then the convoy will move. The Muslims left their bullock carts and thronged around the jeep, protesting and talking loudly. The Muslim officer who stepped off the village went back to the microphone. Silence, I warn you. The convoy will move in 10 minutes. Whether you are on it or not will be no concern of mine. Sikh peasants who had stood apart heard the order and went to the Sikh officer for advice. The officer took no notice of them. He continued staring contemptuously over the upturned collar of his raincoat at the men, cattle, carts, and trucks steaming in the slush and rain. Why, Sardar Sahib? Meet asked Meet Singh nervously. Is not the Lambardar right? One should not touch another's party. There is always danger of misunderstanding. The officer looked Meet Singh up and down. You are quite right, Bhai. There is some danger of being misunderstood. One should never touch another's property. One should never look at another's woman. One should just let others take one's goods and sleep with one's sisters. The only way people like you and will understand anything is by being sent over to Pakistan. Have your sisters and mothers raped in front of you? Have your clothes taken off and being sent back with a kick and spit on your behinds? The officer's speech was a slap in the face with all the peasants, but someone sniggered. Everyone turned around to look. It was Malli with his 5 companions. With them were the few young refugees who were staying at the Sikh temple. None of them belonged to Mano Majra. Sir, the people of this village are famous for their charity, said Malli, smiling. They cannot look after themselves. How can they look after other people? But do not bother, Sardar Sahib. We will take care of Muslim property. You can tell the other officers to leave it with us. It will be quite safe if you can detail some of your soldiers to prevent looting by these people. There was complete confusion. People ran hither and thither, shouting at the tops of their voices. Despite the Muslim officer's tone of finality, villagers clamored around him, protesting and full of suggestions. He came up to his uh, Sikh colleague and surrounded by his bewildered co-religionists. Can you make arrangements for taking over what is left behind? Before the Sikh could answer, a babel of protest burst from all sides. The Sikh remained tight-lipped and aloof. The Muslim officer turned around sharply. Shut up, he yelled. The murmuring died down. He spoke again, punctuating each word with a stab of his forefinger. I give you 5 minutes to get into trucks with just as much luggage as you carry in your hands. Those who are not in will be left behind, and this is the last time I will say it. It is all settled, said the Sikh officer. His speaking softly in Punjabi. I have arranged that these people from the next village will look after the cattle and carts and house till it is over. I will have a list made and sent over to you. His colleague did not reply. He had a sardonic smile on his face. Mano Majra, Sikhs and Muslims looked on helplessly. There was no time to make arrangements. There was no time even to say goodbye. Truck engines were started. Pathan soldiers rounded up the Muslims, drove them back to the carts for a brief minute or two, and then on to the trucks. In the confusion of rain, mud, and soldiers herding the peasants about with the muzzles of their stun guns sticking in their backs, the villagers saw little of each other. All they could do was to shout their last farewells from the trucks. The Muslim officer drove his jeep around the convoy to see that all was in order and then came back to say goodbye to his Sikh colleague. The two shook hands mechanically, without a smile or a trace of emotion. The jeep took its place in front of the line of the trucks. The microphone blared forth once more to announce that they were ready to move. The officer shouted Pakistan. His soldier answered in the chorus forever. The convoy slushed in its way toward Chandunagar. The Sikhs watched them till they were out of sight. They wiped their tears off their faces and turned back to their homes with heavy hearts. Mano Majra's cup of sorrow was not yet full. Sikh officer summoned the Lambardar. All the villagers came with him. No one watched to be left behind. 6 soldiers threw a cordon around them. The officer told the villagers that he had decided to appoint Malli custodian of the evacuated Muslims' property. Anyone interfering with him or his men would be shot. Malli's gang and refugees then unyoked the bullocks, looted the carts, and drove the cows and buffaloes away. Next chapter. Karma. All that morning, people sat in their homes and started despondently through their open doors. They said they saw Mali's men and their refugees ransack Muslim houses. They saw 6 soldiers come and go as if they were on their beats. They heard the piteous lowing of cattle as they were beaten and dragged along. They heard the loud cackle of hens and roosters silenced by the slash of the knife, but they did nothing but sit and sigh. A shepherd boy who had been out gathering mushrooms came back with the news that river had risen. No one took any notice of him. They only wished that it would rise more and drown the whole of Mano Majra along with them, their women, children, and cattle, provided it also drowned Malli, his gang, the refugees, and the soldiers. While the men sighed and groaned, the rain fell in a steady downpour, and the Satluj continued to rise. It spread on the either side of the central piers, which normally contained the winter channels, and joined the pools around the other piers on one broad stream. It stretched right across the bridge, licking the dam which separated it from the fields of Mano Majra. It ran over the many little islands in the river bed till the only tops of the bushes that grew on them could be seen. Colonies of cormorants and terns which were used to roosting there flew over to the banks and then to the bridge, over which no trains had run for several days. In the afternoon, another villager went around to the houses shouting, Oi Banta Singh, the river is rising. Oi Dalip Singha, the river has risen. Oi listen, it is already up to the dam. The people just looked up with their melancholy eyes signifying, We have heard that before. Then another man came with the same message, The river has risen. Then another, till everyone was saying, Do you know the river has risen? At last the Lambardar went out to see for himself. Yes, the river had risen. 2 days of rain could not have caused him. It must have poured in the mountains after the melting of the snows. Sluice gates of canals had probably been closed to prevent the flood from bursting their banks, so there was no outlet except the river. The friendly, sluggish stream of grey had become a menacing and tumultuous spread of muddy brown. The piers of the bridge were all that remained solid and contemptuously defiant of the river. Their pointed edges clove through the sheet of water and let it vent its impotent rage in the soil of eddies and whirlpools. Rain beat up the surface, pockmarking it all over. The Satluj was a terrifying sight. By evening, Mano Majra had forgotten about its Muslims and Malli's misdeeds. The river had become the main topic of conversation. Once more, women stood on the rooftops looking to the west. Men started going in turns to the embankment to report on situation. Before sunset, the Lambardar went up again to see the river. It had risen more since his visit in the afternoon. Some of the clusters of pampas, which had been above the water level, were now partly submerged. Some of the clusters, their stalks had gone limp, and their sodden snow white plums floated on the water. He had never known the Satluj to rise so high in so short a time. Manu Majra was still a long way off, and the mud dam looked solid and safe. Nevertheless, he arranged for a watch to be kept all through the night. Four parties of 3 men each were to take turns and be on the embankment from sunset to sunrise and report every hour. The rest were to stay there in their houses. The Lambardar's decision was a quilt under which the village slept snug and safe. Lambardar himself had little sleep. Soon after midnight, the 3 men on watch came back talking loudly in a high state of excitement. They could not tell in the grey muffled moonlight whether the river had risen more, but they had heard human voices calling for help. The cries came from over the water. They may have been from other side or from the river itself. The Lambardar went out with them. He took his chromium plated flashlight. The 4 men stood on the embankment and surveyed the Satluj, which looked like a sheet of black. The white beam of Lambardar the white beam of the Lambardar's torch scanned the surface of the river. They could see nothing but the swirling water. They held their breath and listened, but they could hear nothing except the noise of rain falling from the water. Each time the Lambardar asked if they were sure that they had heard were women voices and not jackals. They felt more and more uncertain and had to ask each other if it was clear. Wasn't it Karnala? Oh yes, it was clear enough. Hi hi, like someone in pain. The 4 men sat under a tree, huddled around a hurricane lamp. The gunny sacks they used as raincoats were soaking wet. So were all their clothes. An hour later, there was a break in the clouds. The rain slowed down to the drizzle and then stopped. The moon broke through the clouds just above the western horizon. Its reflection on the river made a broad path of shimmering tin foil running from the opposite bank to the men under the tree. On this shining patch of moonlight, even light little ripples of water could be seen distinctly. A black oval object hit the bridge pier and was swept by the stream towards the Mano Majra embankment. It looked like a big drum with sticks on its side. It moved forward and backward and sideways until the current caught it again and brought it into a silvery path not far from where the men were sitting. It was a dead cow with its belly bloated like a massive barrel and its leg stiffly stretched upward. Then followed some blocks of thatch, straw, and bundles of clothing. It looks as if some village has been swept away by the flood, said the Lambardar. Quick, quiet, listen, said one of the villagers in a whisper. The faint sound of a moan was wafted across the waters. Did you hear? Quiet. They held their breath and listened. No, it could not have been human. There was a rumbling sound. They listened again. Of course, it was a rumble. It was the train. Its puffing became clearer and clearer. Then they saw the outlines of the engine and the train itself. It had no lights. There was not even a headlight on the engine. Sparks flew out of the engine funnel like a fireworks. As the train came over the bridge, cormorants flew silently down the bridge, down the river, and terns flew up with shrill cries. The train came to a halt at Mano Majra station. It was from Pakistan. There was no lights on the train. The engine did not whistle. It is like a ghost. In the name of the Lord, do not talk like this, said the Lambardar. It may be a goods train. It must have been the siren you heard. These new American engines wail like someone being murdered. No, Lambardar, we heard the sound more than an hour ago, and same again the same one before the train came on, replied one of the villagers. You cannot hear it anymore. The train is not making any noise now. From across the railway line where some days earlier over 1,000 dead bodies had been burned, a jackal sent up a long plaintive howl. A pack joined him. The men shuddered. Must have been the jackals. They sound like women crying when somebody is dying, said the Lambardar. No, no, protested the other. No, it was a woman's voice, as clear as you are talking to me now. They said and listened and watched strange, indistinguishable forms floating on the flood's water. The moon went down. After a brief period of darkness, the eastern horizon turned grey. Long lines of bats flew across noiselessly. The crows began to caw in their sleep. The shrill cry of a quail came bursting through a clump of trees, and all the world was awake. The clouds had rolled away to the north. Slowly the sun came up and flooded the rain-soaked plain with a dazzling orange brilliance. Everything glistened in the sunlight. The river had risen further. Its turbid water carried carts with the bloated carcass of bulls still yoked to them. Horses rolled from side to side as if they were scratching their backs. There were also men and women with their clothes clinging to their bodies, little children sleeping on their bellies with their arms clutching the water and their tiny buttocks dipping in and out. The sky was soon full of kites and vultures. They flew down and landed on the floating carcasses. They pecked till the corpses themselves rolled over and shooed them off with hands which rose stiffly into the air and splashed back into the water. Some villages must have been flooded at night, said the Lambardar gravely. Who yokes bulls to carts at night? One of the asked one of the companions. Yes, that is true. Why should the bullocks be yoked? More human forms could be seen coming through the arches of the bridge. They rebounded off the piers, paused, pirouetted at the whirlpools, and then came back bouncing down the river. The man moved up towards the bridge to see some corpses which had drifted near the bank. They stood and stared. Lambardar, they were not drowned, they were murdered. An old peasant with a grey beard lay flat on the water. His arms were stretched out as if he had been crucified. His mouth was wide open, showed his toothless gums. His eyes were covered with films. His hair floated with his head like a hollow. He had a deep wound in his neck, which slanted down from the side to the chest. A child's head butted into the old man's armpit. There was a hole in its back. There was another, many other coming down to the river, like logs hewn on the mountains and cast into streams to be carried down to the plains. A few passed through the middles of the arches and sped onward faster. Others bumped into the piers and turned over to show their wounds till the current turned them over again. Some were without limbs. Some had their bellies torn open. Many women's breasts were slashed. They were floated down the sunlit river, bobbing up and down. Overhead hung the kites and vultures. The Lambardar and the villagers drew the needs of their turbans across the faces. The Guru, have mercy on us, someone whispered. There have been a massacre somewhere. We must inform the police. The police? A small man said bitterly. What will they do? First, write a first information report. Sick and with heavy hurts, the party turned back to Mano Majra. They did not know what to say to people when they got back. The river had risen further. Some villages had been flooded. There there had been a massacre somewhere upstream. There were hundreds of corpses flying on the Satluj, or just keep quiet. When they came back to the village, nobody was about to hear what they had to say. They were all on the rooftops looking at the station. After several days, a train had drawn up at Mano Majra in the daytime. Since the engine faced eastward, it must have come from Pakistan. This time too the place was full of villagers and policemen, and the station had been cordoned off. The news of the corpses on the river was shouted from the housetops. People told each other about the mutilation of women and children. Nobody wanted to know who the dead people were, and nor wanted to go to the river to find out. There was a new interest at the station. With the promise of worse horrors, than the last one. There was no doubt in anyone's mind what the train contained. They were sure that the soldiers would come for oil and wood. They had no more oil to spare, and the wood they had left was too damp to burn. But the soldiers did not come. Instead, a bulldozer arrived from somewhere. It began dragging its lower jaws into the ground just outside the station on the Manu Majra side. It went along, eating up the earth, chewing it, and casting it aside. It did this for several hours until there was a rectangular trench almost 50 yards long with mounds of earth on either side. Then it paused for a break. So the soldiers and policemen who had been idly watching the bulldozers at work were called to order and marched back to the platform. They came back in twos carrying canvas stretchers. They tipped the stretchers into the pit and went back to the train for more. This went all day till sunlight. Then the bulldozer woke up again. It opened its jaws and ate up the earth it had thrown out before and vomited it into the trench till it was the level with the ground. The place looked like the scar of the healed up wound. Two soldiers were left to guard the grave from the depredation of jackals and badgers. That evening, the entire village turned up for the evening prayers at the Gurudwara. This had never happened before, except on the Guru's birthday or on the New Year's Day in April. The only regular visitors to the temple were old women and men. Others came to have their children named for baptism, weddings, and funerals. Attendance at prayers had been steadily going up since the murder of the moneylender. People did not want to be alone. Since the Muslims had gone, their deserted houses with doors swinging wide open had acquired an eerie, haunted look. Villagers walked past them quickly without turning their heads. The one place of refuge to which people could go without much explanation was the Gurudwara. Men came pretending that they would be needed, women just to be with them, and they brought the children. The main hall where the scriptures was kept and the two rooms on the side were jammed with refugees and villagers. Their shoes were neatly arranged in the rows on the other side of the threshold. Meet Singh read the evening prayer by the light of the hurricane lamp. One of the men stood behind him waving a fly whisk. When the prayer was over, the congregation sang a hymn while Meet Singh folded the Granth in gaudy silk scarves and laid it to the rest for the night. The whispers stood up and folded their hands. Meet Singh took his place in front. He repeated the names of the 10 gurus, the Sikh martyrs, the Sikh shrines, and invoking their blessings.